I thought the audio sounded good without the mic too. I think it echoes a bit, at least from down here, but y'all said it sounds better like this. I'm going with it. So div, you'll often see this empty div, which is used as a placeholder, then we'll add information later to it. Some tags are what we call self-closing. Now the echo is really bugging me. Some tags are what we call self-closing. So in general, we have an open tag and a closing tag. The closing tag will have a slash to say this is the end of the definition of this element. Some tags are self-closing, meaning they have this slash right here, and they don't have an open and close tag. The open and close tag is the same tag. It just opens and closes itself. It is an entire element defined in one tag instead of an open and a close. Images, IMG, are going to be like this. For an image, I'll talk about properties in a second, but you need to specify the path to the image that's going to be displayed. A break, this is a line break in HTML. I don't have anything to say about that. It's a new line character. If we want a new line or a horizontal rule, one of my favorite HTML elements that, I think are underused. I use them on the course website. I like having just horizontal rules. It's just a horizontal line on a page. All self-closing tags. HTML elements can have properties or attributes. I'm going to say the wrong thing, ain't I? I already did. HTML elements can have attributes. We specify these as key value pairs inside the open tag of an element or inside the only tag if it's a self-closing element. So I have this div. This is an element of type div with one attribute named ID with the value myDiv. This meta, which I guess should be self-closing, I should have my slash here. HTML is pretty forgiving, or browsers, I should say, are pretty forgiving. You can have a lot of mistakes in your HTML, and it'll still render. You shouldn't, but I'm pretty sure I should have a slash here to self-close this meta. Meta, this tag, has an attribute called charset equal to UTF-8. So we have elements and properties, and elements can be nested. For example, this head element contains two other elements, meta and title. Comments, no line comments for what it's worth. We only have block comments in HTML, and this is the syntax for them. Less than exclamation dash dash to start the block, and then dash dash greater than to end the block. And we can escape characters in HTML. This will be important when we talk about security, which I think comes up next week or this Friday. I forget exactly where that lecture landed. We can escape characters. So if we want to specify a character, we can specify its Unicode value, like this. If we have that in our HTML, that's going to render to the appropriate Unicode character, which in this case is a rook. And some characters have special names where we, instead of remembering their Unicode IDs, their encoding, we can specify them by name, and then the browser is going to know when it sees this in our HTML, it sees ampersand, RARR, semicolon, it knows to render that as a right arrow. So some of these are names, some of those are very useful, like non-breaking space. HTML will only respect one space in our code. So if I, right here, hold down the space bar and put 1,000 spaces there, it's only going to render as one single space. So if you need just a little bit more space in between your words, slap a non-breaking space in there. If you need a lot of space between words, don't just keep cut and pasting non-breaking space. It's bad form, it's bad practice. There are other ways to get longer spaces, like using a span and giving it a width. But non-breaking space, if you just need a little bit more space. If you want, like in this example, 3 spaces, I have a space here, which is respected, a space here, which is going to be respected because it's in between 2 things, and then a non-breaking space. So I actually get 3 space characters here. And that's HTML. That's all I want to talk about. Defined using XML syntax, XML style syntax. It is not XML. Open tags and closing tags to define elements. Elements can be nested. Some elements are self-closing. Elements can have attributes. Block comments, that I'm less concerned about. But and you can escape characters in HTML, and the browser will render them to their actual characters instead of whatever you type here. Like, the user will not see ampersand NBSP semicolon. They're just going to see an extra space there. I'll probably say this 3 times in this lecture. It'll pop up on 3 separate slides. But if you want more information, if you do want, what's an ordered list, what's an unordered list, and just a parade of different HTML element types, W3 Schools has you covered. For HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all the basics of front-end development, I think W3 Schools, it's just a straightforward, no BS tutorial. It just cuts down to just what you need to know to get stuff done. I like it. It's the reason they're very popular. If you like other tutorials, find whatever works for you. But I like W3 Schools for intro to front-end web development. It's just got a lot of tutorials, and they've grown a lot since they first came around. There's so many tutorials. There's a lot of back-end stuff too on there these days. You can learn MongoDB and MySQL there these days. For example, if you want to see all the commands for that, but lots of good stuff there.
So we're allowed to use W3 Schools?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're allowed to use whatever you want. You can't just cut and paste code from the internet, but you can use whatever resource helps you learn. I'm not going to restrict you. Do other classes restrict you? Oh. I have opinions about that. Yeah.
If we have a specific error message that we can't figure out, is it okay if we look that up to see other people's
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So the reason I am pro those things is because that's what you're going to be doing your whole career. You're going to be Googling shit. We're professional Googlers. It's really what we are. I Google stuff every day, even just to come up with lecture examples and stuff. I don't remember the syntax for every little thing. I'm Googling stuff all the time. That's an important skill I want you to practice. That's why right in my expectations for the course, I say find and read and understand documentation. That's exactly what I'm talking about there, is finding the resources. I Google how to center a div every semester. I Google how to center a div, and I still don't know how to center a div. Centering a div is impossible, especially if you want it vertically centered. I still don't know how to vertically center anything on a web page. It's such a pain in the ass. The containing element, it always shrinks to the smallest size. So I center it vertically in that element, but it's shrunk vertically. You got to get the vertical height to be 100%, and there's 18 containing element. Oh, it's such a pain. Such a pain. I'm sure it's coming across in this lecture, but I don't like front-end development. I don't like front-end development at all. It's just a pain. That's why I teach the back-end class. All right, but that's HTML. Yeah, Flexbox did make things a lot easier. So HTML is going to define the structure of our page. It's going to define, okay, we have these elements nested inside these elements in this order. It's the structure of the page. And that's all your HTML should be doing. Of course, the lines get blurred in certain applications. There's some cases, these aren't hard and true facts, rules you have to follow. But HTML in general is going to define the structure of your program. And CSS is going to define the style of your program. What you want things different colors, you want things different sizes and everything. As much as possible should be defined in your CSS separate from your HTML. HTML is just concerned with this goes here, this goes here, this goes here, and then use CSS to figure out how that's actually going to be displayed to the user. So we want to keep our styling separate from our structure. So this is an important design philosophy of all of programming and all of development, really. But front-end development, explicitly tries to keep these things separate and keeps your CSS separate from your HTML. Now, you can define all your CSS inside your HTML, and I discourage that strongly, but it's good practice to keep them separate. If you're doing, for your project, and if you're not using my sample website, if you're building your own, this is not a front-end course, so you're never going to be graded on how good your front ends look. I'm just not gonna. I'm not gonna care. I will care. I mean, if you build a really good front end, I'll be impressed and I'll care in that sense. But it's not going to affect your grade if you don't do that. If you have the most ass-looking project, just everything's all over the place, that's fine. Look at the sample site I gave you. It's really, it's pretty crappy. Like, I just made sure I have the things that I needed on there to be able to have you do homework one. Like, it's no frills. It's not great. If I'm giving you that, I don't expect anything more from you. So it's not an art class. I'm fine with whatever you give me. I'm focused on the functionality of the server, not the look of the front end. We have other courses here. I think there's a DMS. Is that the acronym? There's a DMS course where you build front ends and make your web pages look pretty. And there's Alan's course, Human-Computer Interaction, where you learn how to build a nice functioning front end with usability in mind. I'll defer to those courses for front end discussions. Like I said, this will be the only lecture on front end that I'm going to cover. I have, I have a lot of back end functionality to cover in this semester, so I couldn't fit in much front end if I wanted to. But here's some CSS. Here's the syntax of it. In our CSS file, we're going to specify an element, braces, and then any attributes we want for elements of that type. So this, I'm going to say the body, the background should be aqua. And we can use our hex values, our RGB values for colors, or there's some named colors. So aqua is a named color. If I want to use a non-named color, I'm using red here, so I could just say red. But if I want to specify the RGB and have full flexibility, I can do that. 2-character R for red, 2-character green, 2-character blue. They're hexadecimal, so FF is full-on red, and then 00, no green, no blue. Then font size, just like HTML, I'm not going to parade all the different attributes that you can set through CSS. There's tons of them. Half of them don't work the way they're supposed to, and CSS is a pain. But if you can tame it, if you can get it to work, you can really make your websites looking real sharp. So if this is our HTML and this is our CSS, this is what we'll get. This is what our web page is going to look like. Very beautiful, I know. I hate picking colors, by the way. I know those colors look terrible together, but I spend way too long adjusting RGB values, and then it's still not the right color. I'm not an artist, I'm sorry. But in our HTML, we have to add a few lines if we're going to do our CSS. If we're going to add CSS, we need to effectively import the CSS into our HTML. We're going to use this link element. We're going to say this is a link to a style sheet, so add this styling to this page. It is a CSS style sheet, and here's the URL, here's the path where to find it. These paths can be absolute or relative, just like our redirects, our location in our redirects. Style.css, this is a relative path, so a request, whatever request was made to obtain this HTML, there's going to be another HTTP request for that same host and port at the path style.css. So I'm expecting a request. If I put this in my HTML, I'm expecting a request to my server for the path /style.css. And when I get that request, I better be serving up some CSS in my response. So in the sample page that you have for homework 1, there's HTML with a linked style sheet, and there's a JavaScript file that's linked in the HTML. And when you get that HTML, the browser is going to see those. Like in this case, it's going to see this link and say, oh, I have to make another HTTP request to get some more context for this page. Before I start rendering it, I need style.css so I can apply that styling to this web page. So to load this page, you're going to see two HTTP requests, one for the HTML and one for the CSS. Get the HTML, start reading, parsing through the HTML. Browser sees this and fires off another HTTP request. So there are multiple HTTP requests to get a single page. And then this paragraph will have that style added to it. So my content right here has this styling. Background is aqua. My first web page didn't have any styling attached to it, so it's just going to be the default, the size of an H1 header and black text. But this isn't super flexible yet. If I have this in my CSS, every single paragraph on my page has to be red, large red text. It's not always what we want. What if I have two paragraphs? I want one to be red and one to be green. Well, CSS is going to help us with classes. So we're going to add a class attribute to our HTML open tags to our elements, and then we're going to use those class names in our CSS. So I'm going to specify class red, class green, and in my CSS I'm going to say every single paragraph on this page, I want some big font. Every single paragraph, period, all of them. And then I'm going to use this dot notation, p.red. Any paragraph that has a class of red, change the font to red. Any paragraph with a class of green, make it green. Yeah.
So in your top CSS function, if you were to set the color of that to purple, would it still be red and green?
Oh boy. I want to say no. I want to say it would be red and green, but this is where CSS gets tricky to work with. It should be red and green. So the question is, if in my in my paragraph one, if I said color should be purple, would the text be purple or red and green? I believe it should be red and green because these are more specific. They should override. The purple should cascade down as part of the namesake. I'm a little bit out of my element here, but should cascade down, but then these should override. But I think the order of the declaration matters as well. I think if these are above the P, I forget exactly how it works, but all I know is my stuff never shows up the way I want it to. It gets trickier when you're importing something like Bootstrap, and you have a big old CSS file for Bootstrap, and then you're also adding your custom CSS. They can conflict in strange ways. And then how do you get the actual values that you want on the elements that you want? It gets tricky. And people start putting exclamation point important everywhere, but now you have to override something that's deemed important. How do you do that? Is it super duper important? Like, it gets messy. Working with CSS is a real art form that can take a while to get good at. I have never gotten good at it. I have not invested the time. Okay, but that doesn't give us full, we have more flexibility we can add. So before I was saying any paragraph with this class, attach these properties to it. But what if we have elements with different tag element types that we want to have the same class? I want this paragraph to be red text. I want this div to be red text. I just want any element of any type. If I give it the class red, I want it to have red text. Or anything green. Oh, why do I have this example set up so weird? I thought I had it set up different. But we can do that by just dot green. So dot green without the P, this is going to say any element. I should have a div with class green too, right? To make this example make more sense. This dot green is going to say any element with the class green, regardless of its type, should have green text. So if I had a div class equals green, that would also get green text. But since here I say p.red, this is any paragraph with the class red gets red text. So this div, even though it has class red, is not going to be red text. But if this div was class green, it would have green text. So it says any element of any type with this class type. And lastly, we can specify a specific ID if we want to style a single element. We can give it an ID. IDs in HTML have to be unique. And we can use hashtag ID to style, that single element, that unique element with that ID. Elements can have multiple classes separated by spaces. I don't have much to say about that, but space separate them. And I think this is where things really get wonky, because if those classes both specify a color, for example, what color do we get? That's where things really start falling apart for CSS, if you're not careful. And that's CSS. That's all I'm covering here. There are other things. For example, you can specify for different screen widths and screen sizes, apply different stylings. So you resize a screen on a lot of web pages. If you resize it small enough, you'll get the mobile version and mobile styling of the page. More than just CSS going on there, but you can do that with CSS. There are a lot of other things, a lot of properties that you can attach. W3 Schools has got you covered. JavaScript in like 2 minutes. We can do this, right? So I'm not going to cover JavaScript syntax again. W3 Schools. I'll say that a bunch. But I do want to cover some basics and specifically why even use JavaScript. The reason is that HTML and CSS are not programming languages. Technically, HTML and CSS combined, because somebody called me out one year, so I have to say this every semester. HTML and CSS combined is technically a Turing-complete programming language, but for the love of God, don't use it. Just use JavaScript. It's a pain to do anything with it. JavaScript is going to give us programming functionality. Everything you've learned for the past few years about programming, we want to be able to apply that to our web pages. We can't do that with HTML and CSS, at least not easily. So JavaScript is going to be our programming language to be able to modify the pages more dynamically, and whatever you can code in JavaScript, you can do on that page. That's what we want for this. With just HTML and CSS, this is what I like to call poster sites. If your goal of your web page is just to disseminate information, this is perfectly fine. If you have a restaurant and you want to post the menu online with a phone number, call us for information or whatever, that's perfectly fine. But if you want anything that does anything, we need some JavaScript in there. So if you want any user interaction, a chat site. We'll see a few different versions of chat sites in this class because it's the simplest thing to show. But if you want users to interact, to be able to communicate with each other or make posts or really anything, we're going to need some JavaScript in there. And specifically, it's ECMA script for those of you who care about the distinction. JavaScript is an implementation of ECMA script, and ECMA script is the definition, is the standard. So JavaScript is a programming language, and the way it works is when you go to a web page, you request the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, download all that onto your machine, save it, and then run that program. This can be very scary. This can be very dangerous. You don't want somebody else's code, arbitrary code, just running on your machine. So there are certain safety precautions that are taken with JavaScript. Specifically, you can't read and write files. This is one of the big limitations. You can't access other tabs or windows. That one goes a little more without saying. And you can't access any storage from other sites. This first one is the big one that we feel when programming. So you can't read and write files. The why is pretty clear. You don't want JavaScript being able to just navigate your whole file system and just read everything. send it all back to the some attack site or something. We don't want that. So it cannot read and write files. Where we feel this is you can't even read and write your own files. If you want JavaScript that reads your .html file, you can't do that. If you want to serve a JSON file on your server and then have your JavaScript request that file, your HTML, the browser requests that file, and then you want to read that file, you can't do that. Not even your own files. So it's something to keep in mind when you're using JavaScript. I'm looking at the clock's always 2 minutes fast. But I do want to shut this down. We'll just save the rest of the slides for Wednesday, because I'm not going to get through all of them. But we'll see a little bit of JavaScript starting Wednesday. I'm going to get to the lecture question. Yeah, we'll save those slides for Wednesday. And have a great day. I'll see everyone Wednesday.